morning. That was a sudden response. Normally, it takes much longer for people to go quiet. I take this as a sign of impatience that we start. The door's been closed. There's still some people waiting to get through security, so occasionally there may be some noise in the background as more people come in. Welcome to this panel on the water challenge, which is really the panel that tries to answer the question, whether there will be wars over water or whether there will be peace through cooperation over water. And that's the challenge. If there is only one challenge, that's the one, and you have a great panel here today in order to address those. I think it is important to remind ourselves that there is an increasing understanding that the water environment and the changing water environment has a huge impact on human security. When you watch the news tonight, probably there will be new pictures from the flooding catastrophe in Pakistan. And we still remember other flooding catastrophes, but we also remember the droughts and the famine and the migration that happened as a result of this, and the resulting conflicts, the effort that the international community has to put into humanitarian assistance, and the security concerns for those people who live in camps for a while, not knowing exactly when they will go back, whether in some cases they will be able to ever go back. This destabilizes communities, it destabilizes the neighboring communities into which migrants move. And although the literature and increasingly the policy debate says that it's very unlikely that we will have wars over water, water is not the casus belli as such. We recognize that the migration that is induced because of changes in the water environment, the food security that depends on the availability of water in rain-fed agriculture, for example, that all these developments contribute to exacerbating tensions that are there, aggravating conflicts that may arise, and may tip a conflict that is low level into something that becomes armed and violent. We need to understand that link a little bit better, but we also need to understand that as we analyze these threats and think about what can security policy do, what can the military do, we realize that except in specific circumstances where the logistical capacities of the military apparatus, the planning and the execution power that they have may be needed, for example, for humanitarian assistance, there is very little that military planning, that security policy can do in order to improve water management. Water management in the sense of bringing the water that they need to the people where they are, but also protecting the people from the effects of water when there is too much. These are things that cannot be done by military and security policy means, but they have to be done by water management and environmental policy means. It means protecting the forests in the headwaters. It means making sure that there is safe areas inside of the floodplains where people can go when the waters come. It means being prepared and having the stocks in place to feed and the population and provide it with clean water until such time that life is safe again. It may also mean other things. You have a great panel here today to address those questions, and I will be addressing them in turn just before inviting them to give an initial statement of about 5 minutes. But before I do that, I would like to mention and thank the sponsors of this panel, the Water Challenge, and that is, as you can see from the little flags here and the panels here, it's the Radenska water company. They sell mineral water that is famous in Slovenia. When in Slovenia you go into a restaurant or a bar and you want to have mineral water, you don't ask for mineral water, you ask for Radenska. It has become this synonymous name for Radenska. Their classic product is the Radenska Classic is the name that, and it's becoming increasingly known not only in Austria and Germany, where I've noticed it, but also in other parts of the world. It's a company with a 140-year history, and in order to produce the quality of the water that it has, it needs to protect and preserve its sources, and that is an engagement for environmental protection that really has become part of the culture and the heart of that company. In your packs, if you didn't throw them away, you find this little brochure and you can read up on them. And we are grateful that they provided us with little bottles to keep us refreshed here on the panel. So with that, I want to ask the first of the panelists, European Commissioner Janez Potočnik, now European Commissioner for the Environment, and you come from Slovenia, but before that, actually, Slovenia would not be in the European Union if it weren't for him. because he headed the negotiation team for all those years and then became shadow commissioner for enlargement with Günther Verheugen, and then for many years served as commissioner for research and technology before now assuming the position of commissioner for the environment. And I think in a way that aligns your interests and the interests of the Slovenian government with the position that you now hold in Brussels. As a commissioner, you're supposed to be European and only true blue European, but I'm sure that in this place you can't forget your roots in Slovenia. Commissioner.
Thank you, Andreas. Of course, yeah, it's good to start the first after vacations obligation in my own country. Actually, it's not only in my own country, it's also in my own region, which is even better. There is a saying that when the well is dry, we know the value of water. Of course, I sincerely hope that we have realized the value of water well before the wells will be dry. 20th century, it's the century which we can name the century of great acceleration. We have experienced a four-fold growth in population, 40-fold growth in economic output. But we also increased our use of fossil fuels 16 times, our fishing catches 35 times, our water use 9 times, our carbon emissions 17 times. Of course, this kind of resource abuse in a way continues in a very different world. It is more fragile, more competitive, connected, interdependent. There are many huge challenges which are living among us: climate change, future energy supply, food, water, scarcity, biodiversity loss, and so on. Water is certainly one of our greatest challenges. If you don't believe it, just ask any of the millions of Pakistanians fighting for their lives because of the floods or flood-related diseases. I was following quite closely the announcement for the today session in the media, but water was not mentioned. It was mentioned that we will discuss energy, that we will discuss Balkans, Western Balkans. Unfortunately, I can guarantee you that in the next years this will not happen again. It will be mentioned. A short overview of the activities which we are doing on our level. Of course, we have activities on international level, then we have activities on European level. On the international level, our response is framed through the Millennium Development Goals and the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And you probably know that the progress towards the achievement of the global objectives include also 2 of the targets which are connected with the water: to reduce by half by 2015 the proportion of people without sustainable access to safe drinking water, and the second is to the basic sanitation. This will be reviewed at the upcoming New York summit this month, next month in September. I plan to attend it. The European Community response to these goals, it's so-called European Union Water Initiative, which integrates water resources management through the river basin approach. It is an approach developed through the European experience and resulting from close to 1.5 billion euros of water project funding. Its success depends on the strong partnership, work together with the member states, developing countries, specific regions, civil society stakeholders, private sector, of course, people. The objective is better governance in water sector and more regional investment to lay the ground of the regional cooperation. It also aims to make the existing financial mechanisms more efficient and streamlined, and one of these mechanisms is, of course, the most important. It's the EU Water Initiative, which created a 500 million euro water facility fund. This will deliver greater investment in water and sanitation services in sub-Saharan Africa, Caribbean, Pacific. Between 2004 and 2007, 177 projects, and further funding of 200 euros will be seen, the facility helping even more people from now on till 2013. This is the funding angle. The second part is, of course, then how to get the political dialogue started, which can lead to the right infrastructure being put in place. especially, of course, in developing countries. This is why the EU-Africa Partnership on Infrastructure, it's also important. It responds directly to the need of regional integration and growth voiced by the African Union, and it is supported by the Infrastructure Trust Fund. This is designed to get the additional finance for infrastructure development through the mixture of EU grants with loans from EIB, other European and African development financing institutions. That's about our international engagement, EU policies and goals. In the center, it's of course the European Union Water Framework Directive. It takes into account the fact that all our waters are connected, that we use water for all kinds of human activities. Most Europeans live in transboundary river basins, and this is why we make the river basin approach as a center. Water boundaries, as you can imagine, are fluid. There is a good international cooperation happening already through international river commissions among 14 countries who share the Danube, among 9 along the Rhine, for example. These are the examples of good practice and are worth sharing. We are now 10 years after its adoption, Water Framework Directive, and we are reaching the crucial phase of implementation of this directive with the adoption of so-called river basin management plans. The idea, the target is that we would reach good water status by 2015. There are still many challenges, things like integration into agriculture, transport, energy policies, the application of the water pricing policies, which is again a very important issue. Then we are working on EU strategy on water scarcity and droughts, which complements the directive. It stresses the importance of water hierarchy. Water demand management should come first, and alternative supply options should only be considered once the potential of water savings and efficiency has been exhausted. We are trying to integrate the water policy management flows through the European broader policies too into the European Commission flagship initiative on resource efficiency. This is the one on which I will be working very intensively next year. We have developed the so-called macro-regions approaches. There is an approach on EU-Baltic strategy and the Danube strategy, one of the things which I'm seriously considering, and it might also solve some of the issues which are currently at stake, is something like that for Mediterranean or even for the Adriatic Sea. I think it would be very much needed. I will not touch a lot on the climate change as a driver to our water policies, because I'm sure that there are other panelists who will touch that more in depth, but I can just say that IPPC themselves have said that the water quantity and quality due to the climate change will be the main pressures on the societies and the environment. In response to that, to the growing impact of climate change, we adopted last year the white paper on how we can adapt better to it. This highlights the need to increase the resilience of health, property, and the productive functions of land to climate change by improving the management of water resources and ecosystems. One of the crucial issues will be how this will be dealt in other policies: agriculture, regional, energy, industrial, transport, research, to name just a few. So I think that integrated approach is crucial. To conclude, you have probably heard that I have many times spoken about the importance of the right governance being put in place. It's the same when we talk about water and water policies. I hope I have also been able to show that in Europe a lot of effort has been put to the water policies. We are now not trying to reinvent the wheel, because the main policy and legislative framework is already in place, but we are trying, however, to refine our policies. The blueprint for safeguarding European waters will be presented in 2012, and it is fully in line with all these principles. It will look at 3 main issues. First, member states' success in implementing the river basin approach, which tackles all pressures on European waters. Second, the potential for water savings and increasing water availability and climate resilience. And third, to the extent to which other policy areas are contributing to the achievement of good water status in 2015. It might also contain elements of the new EU innovation strategy, including so-called innovation partnership, which will be a new tool which we are developing, which would boost innovation in the water sector. This in turn could contribute to achieving the even more sustainable use of water. The blueprint is not meant to tell us how to change our existing water-focused directives. They will, after all, only deliver in 2015. It is instead a way for us to reinforce our EU water policies and to join them to point them in the right direction. And flowing in the right direction truly sounds good, sounds logical when we talk about the water policies. Thank you.
Thank you for Commissioner Potočnik. That actually counted for 2 introductions because it was 10 minutes long. But I take from it you underline the need to integrate the water policy concerns into other policies. I take from it the centrality of the Water Framework Directive for the policies inside the European Union. And I take from it the cyclical nature, evaluating what works in the member states and producing, after 10 years of applying this Water Framework Directive, learning and reporting and learning the lessons and then improving the policy. It's the cyclical policy management approach that I take away from your comments. The second panelist comes from a completely different place, Jorge Borges from the Cape Verde. He is State Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Cooperation and Communities. Before that, he was Deputy Minister for Economy, Growth and Competitiveness, and therefore links policy areas in an interesting way. He may come from a country that consists of 9 islands and a large diaspora, but he also worked he was head of the regional office for Southern Africa and many other functions in the Center for Development and Enterprise, and in that capacity worked in Botswana as well as in Brussels, but always looking at Southern Africa as a whole. So his perspective is more than just an island man, even though islands are very challenging places for water management purposes.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to offer our thanks to the BLED Forum organizers for the invitation to participate in this event. As someone from Cape Verde, an island nation in the Sahel zone off the coast of West Africa, water has always been a critical challenge for us. We very much understand and know that we can't take water for granted. The lack of water has been a cause of major famines in our history and continues until today to be a critical constraint for our nation, hindering economic growth and our ability to reduce poverty. Importantly, it is limiting the quality of life for our population. Although we have the Atlantic Ocean, and it is everywhere, fresh water remains a scarce resource for us. Average annual rainfall is only about 227 millimeters, and only 20% of that ends up in groundwater systems. Yet there are no rivers or streams. The result is that we have had to depend on costly desalination process for our water needs. This can only be appreciated by the fact that up to this year we rely on imports of petroleum products to desalinate about 90% of our water needs. Despite our challenging situation, however, many semi-arid and arid countries in Africa do not have the luxury of being located near the sea or in the middle of the Atlantic with abundant seawater that can be desalinated. It is clear that there is a consensus which is slowly emerging around the world about the water challenge facing the humanity. It is due in part to events like this, which is providing an international platform to discuss the issue and challenges posed by water scarcity. Unlike what we have had to deal with in the past, this is a complex and multifaceted challenge. It will impact on the idea of civilization and life. However, despite the emerging consensus on the challenge, we, as the global community, have not been able to develop a common response or a strategy to address the challenges and threats posed. We have been slow to recognizing the issues and their interlinkages. Additionally, we have been slow to fashioning out a global response to what essentially is a global problem, and some may say it is an existential problem for many. Estimates are that Africa has already crossed the 1 billion marks. Similarly, other regions of the world are also growing. Despite the concerns about lack of population growth in some advanced economies, the world's population continues to grow at a rapid rate. High population growth combined with ever high consumption level is fueling increasing demand for food and energy. The result has been a disaster for the environment, with desertification on the rise. In Africa, we are witnessing the continuous expansion of the Sahara Desert, and in many respects, we are already feeling the effect of climate change, which some have refused to accept or believe partly because of politics. Sadly, it is the poor and the developing nations that are more affected by the encroaching deserts, the changing patterns of precipitation, the longer drought, and the extreme meteorological events. We see this in the news daily. Water, in many ancient traditions and culture, is recognized as the source of life. As the great Nigerian Afrobeat musician Fela Kuti noted in one of his popular songs, "Water no get enemy." Indeed, water has no enemy and could not have an enemy. We must therefore find the wherewithal and the leadership to begin to tackle the water challenge. We will need a shared vision that the global community buys into, whether rich, poor, or in between. We need shared sacrifice and not as usual, where the poor and most vulnerable are called upon to bear the most of the burden. We will need a robust strategy. Importantly, we need enlightened leadership and followership. We also need the engagement of all. This is a global problem and can only be solved through the engagement of all. Each person, each community, and each nation will have to be engaged. Before I end my introductory remarks, let me share with you how our little country, Cape Verde, is responding to this challenging situation. To find solution to the perennial water problem, we have adopted a new strategy which is focused on capturing as much as possible surface water, water use through water recycling, and adapting renewable energy as a way to fuel our desalination process. As I have noted earlier, we rely on desalination for about 90% of our water needs. As of this year, less than 3% of our power needs are met through renewable energy. But our government made a conscious decision a few years back to systematically move towards renewable energy for our power needs. By the next year, over 25% of power needs will be met through wind energy. We have raised and are investing millions of euros in solar power and in additional wind power. We have committed our country to meeting 50% of our power needs through renewable energy source by the year 2020, and to have one of our 9 islands which are inhabited to obtain 100% of its power through source by the same period. We are doing this because we realize the danger ahead. We understand the cost of an island nation without resource. Beyond the technology aspects, we are working on improved management of the sector, we are educating our population, and we are making sure we overcome the infrastructure and institutional deficit. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Georges Borges. I take from this the insight that water management challenges, that is a global problem, but it comes in local circumstances. And it's a reminder that something that is ubiquitous, something that you find in many different places, is not necessarily the same as something that is global and universal. We need to consider the specific circumstances. I also take away from the focus on Africa the importance of looking at desertification and what that means for the livelihoods of people. And I learned that the technology of desalination may be good in some locations, but may have problems and limitations in other locations. Let me turn to the third panelist. Carrie Ann Jones is Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau in the State Department in the United States, in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. Your career is difficult to summarize because there are so many high-level positions, notably for 3-4 years in the National Science Foundation and a similar period of time in the White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy from 96 to 99. So summarizing it, I would say your career stretched from science and administration to politics and policies. The floor is yours.
Thank you. You make me tired thinking about that. Thank you, Dr. Kramer. I'm very pleased to be here today, in particular to talk about water. And as many previous speakers have said, I too really want to congratulate the organizers of this forum for putting together a meeting that's so interesting and timely and important. And I want to thank them for inviting me to participate here today. The topic we are addressing in this panel is a critical global issue. On World Water Day earlier this year, our Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, pointed out that in many ways water defines our blue planet, and that it's critical to every aspect of human endeavor, from agriculture to industry to energy. We are facing an increasingly daunting collection of facts that demonstrate the breadth and the depth of the challenge. The facts today are, and many of you have heard these in different settings, but I'd like to repeat them, that more than 800 million people lack access to safe water. More than 2 billion lack access to basic sanitation. And more than 1.5 million children die each year because of inadequate access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. And tomorrow's predictions paint a very difficult scenario. It is predicted that by 2025, nearly 2/3 of the world's population will be living under water-stressed conditions. Based on the framework that was introduced so eloquently yesterday by President Turk in yesterday's opening session, I believe that the international community has taken the first step he was talking about. The international community has made an honest analysis of the challenge we face. We must now move on to the second step he talked about, and that is to take a realistic assessment of what we can and must do to address the situation, and then, and in the same time, seek out imaginative ways to make progress. I'm going to identify a few areas that I believe need attention, and some of these you have already heard from previous speakers. These are areas that emerge from scanning and looking at the current situation, I think more from not from a real program level, but from a higher order policy level. There is additional funding moving into water now, and we see that the spotlight is beginning to have an effect on things. But I also think we have a ways to go. Because water touches and supports human life in so many ways, it is an issue that can be seen through many sectoral and different governance lenses. It can be seen as a health issue, an agriculture issue, an energy issue, a climate change issue, and an environment issue, and a security issue. Security, both a national security issue as well as a regional security issue. Extreme amounts of water, either too much or too little, can threaten a nation's survival. And a shared river basin can result in tension and regional instability. I mention all of this because I believe that this multidimensional aspect of water has made the challenge even more difficult, as because sometimes when everyone owns a problem, no one really owns that problem. It becomes invisible. The multidimensional character has sometimes made it difficult for developed countries to maintain a focus on water, and it has made it difficult for developing countries sometimes to commit sustained political will to the issue. The fact that water flows through the other major global issues that we confront, health, climate change, energy, food, and security, has often made it less visible than it should be. To me, this situation suggests two very important efforts that we need to undertake. We must ensure the visibility of the water issue as both a diplomatic and a development issue. It must be elevated, and it must remain elevated. And we must ensure that these issues are integrated into our discussions on all of these other global challenges, because it is an essential element of those global challenges. And this integration needs to occur at the national, regional, and international level. With her speech, Secretary Clinton recognized and raised the visibility of water in the U.S. community by stating very clearly, water issues are integral to the success of many of our foreign policy goals. That has energized the U.S. system. We are now moving forward on this challenge, working to coordinate our diplomatic and development efforts, working with our technical agencies who are increasingly engaged internationally, and working to strengthen our international partnerships. Likewise, our Congress is very interested in water. You may or may not know this, but under a specific piece of legislation, the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development are required to report every year what investments are being made to address the water challenges worldwide. The second effort needed is integration. We need to integrate water into our discussions on health, food, economic growth, peace and security, and climate change. And we must recognize that while all of these global issues are related, they also represent the fact that we often compete for resources. They compete for resources. And the resources I'm talking about are human resources, financial resources, and political resources. I think if we are aware of this, we have an opportunity to try to move beyond competition among different important issues and move toward complementarity. Such an approach should allow us to leverage resources and advance all of these critical agendas. Sound water management needs to be seen as a means of improving health, promoting food security and economic growth, advancing education and gender equity, and reducing the likelihood of conflict. The importance and urgency of the water issues must be recognized not only by the water specialists, by those engaged in all of these other sectors. On a country-by-country basis, we need to identify the impacts of water on human health, food security, economic growth, and peace and security. The health minister must be able to understand the relevance of the water problem in terms of the issues he is concerned about, he or she is concerned about, illness and lives lost. Likewise, for the finance minister, we must need to look at the impact on GDP. For national leadership, we need to ask where will future water resources come from? While the presence of water on the international agenda is growing, we must ensure that it cuts across sectors. Two additional efforts I believe we must undertake are coordination and partnership. And for both of these, on this critical issue, we need imagination. There are many efforts currently underway addressing water challenges. We must develop a clear understanding of this work and make sure that these efforts converge. Nations receiving development assistance will need to coordinate their own efforts across sectors and with donor programs. And donors need to look at coordinating their resources in a way that is reinforcing. Some of this is happening, certainly. The UN is now coordinating across many agencies on the topic of water, and many national governments are improving coordination. However, I think we must recognize that coordination is very easy to identify as a need, and yet it is very difficult to achieve. Coordination requires timely information transfer and great flexibility among organizations. How can we begin to think about coordinating across sectors and at the local, national, regional, and international levels? It is an organizational and a management challenge that requires some new thinking and moving beyond the established organizational boundaries we now have. Additional institutions is probably not an answer, but the better use of existing institutions and the development of flexible regional teams may be an approach. We must move beyond our own bureaucratic structures and address this issue quickly, recognizing the timeline that we are up against. Addressing water challenges will also require a global effort where we must seek the best possible partnerships. Some of these are in place and some are emerging. The private sector must be engaged, clearly as a major end user, but also as a source of ideas and investment. Partnerships with research organizations, public and private research organizations, must be strengthened to ensure that innovative solutions are constantly in the pipeline and are developed in ways that fit the local needs. Continued research and development on desalination, wastewater treatment and reuse, irrigation, and salt water tolerant crops are essential. In closing, it is clear to me that water is moving into its rightful place on the list of critical international issues. It is up to us to make sure it stays there, and that the political will to act is mobilized, seeking creative ways to integrate across sectors, coordinate our investments and activities, and develop imaginative, productive partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carrie-Ann Jones, for this. I take from it the underlining the complexity of the water challenge. You talked about the different lenses that each of our policy communities has when looking at the water challenge, and at the different geographies we need to consider and how they're interlinked. You talked about the multidimensional character of water and explained how that leads to a governance challenge, even in the countries that have strong government administrations. They have difficulties, and that is even more challenging for countries that do not have strong systems of public administration, policy development and implementation. Let's go further to the second half of our panel. The next panelist is Francisco Nunes Correa. He is a full professor at Portugal's main engineering school, but he's also a former Minister of Environment and Spatial Planning of Portugal. You heard about the centrality of the European Water Framework Directive. Now here I invite you to meet one of the minds behind this directive. Through his research, but also through his policy advisory work in the 1990s, he helped shape the Water Framework Directive in many of the detailed aspects, but also in the general philosophy. Francisco.
Thank you, Andreas. You make me feel old, after all. Not only tired, but old. Okay, as we all know, water somehow cuts across all sectors of society, and from the previous speeches that was made clear, and in some sense water, or the way water is managed, is somehow a mirror of our societies. You can frame water problems or water issues in many, many different ways. And I decided to frame it around three paradoxes, and the overcoming the equation and the overcoming of those paradoxes is somehow our main challenge. It has been in the past, and now it projects into the future in a more sharp way. Paradox number one: is water abundant or scarce? And the answer is, it is abundant and scarce. Look at Cape Verde. And State Secretary Jorge Borges just explained us how problems are pressing in Cape Verde. It is scarce, certainly. And look at Pakistan. It is too much abundant. And this applies at different scales and in different senses. For instance, water is abundant in the world if you consider oceans and polar ice caps. But if you consider only usable fresh water, it is extremely scarce. There is this interesting analogy. If you consider that all the water in the world, including salt and fresh water, is like a barrel of 100 liters, the usable fresh water is a teaspoon of 3 cubic centimeters. So this gives you this dimension of how water is abundant and at the same time how it is scarce. And it may be abundant and scarce in the same country. Like, for instance, in northern Portugal, we have more than 3,000, almost 4,000 millimeters of rain per year. Then some 100 or 200 kilometers away, we have less than 200 millimeters, 20 times less. So it is abundant and scarce at the same time. And of course, this dichotomy or this paradox raises very serious challenges. And climate change sharpens and aggravates and exacerbates this dichotomy, this contradiction, and making water management a much more demanding activity. And of course, this happens inside each society and among different states. And international policy is necessary to regulate this relationship between different riverine states, between upstream states and downstream states, so that equity can prevail in those situations. Now, paradox number 2, is water a matter for conflict or for cooperation? And of course, the answer is it is a matter for conflict and a matter for cooperation. And there are two famous quotes that just fit in very well in this point. One is by Mark Twain, that is supposed to have written that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting for. I'm not sure that's exactly the case, but it's a funny quote. And the second quote is very famous, and most of you must know it. It's by President John Kennedy, that once said that anyone who can solve the problems of water will be worthy of 2 Nobel Prizes, one for peace and one for science. Fortunately, history and experience shows that in most cases, water lends itself for international cooperation, for building trust and avoiding conflict, rather than for triggering conflict. In many, many cases, and this is shown in many, many articles, water is a dimension of conflict, but it is very rarely the main cause of a conflict. So let's be optimistic, as General Colin Powell yesterday was asking us to be. Let's be optimistic about it. There's a lot to be at the international level, and we have to do it, and something is being done already. The Commissioner mentioned already the conventions on the Danube River, the convention on the Rhine River, and may I call your attention for the very important agreements between Portugal and Spain, dating back from 1867, and with the last convention signed in 1998 under the concept of sustainable development. Those are very interesting cases, and we should build on them. Now, paradox number 3. Is water an amenity or a commodity? It is something to be enjoyed or something to be paid for? And the answer is it is an amenity and it is a commodity. In one hand, we have water in nature and the need to preserve as much as possible the integrity of the ecosystems, those water bodies. This is a social or a collective obligation. But in the other hand, we have water uses for specific activities like agriculture, hydropower, domestic water supply. And based on this, we have what we call water services and water industry. And there is a tension, there's always a tension in each society between collective ownership of the resource and appropriation for economic activities that should provide a service and have a profit. And this leads a problem to a very, very famous debate that is going on about the right to water and how to reconcile all this with the right to water that is now globally accepted. Well, the right to water should be understood as the right of having access to water for your reasonable needs at a socially acceptable cost. Okay, these 3 paradoxes synthesize, I think, some of the major problems and challenges. And here again, as the President of Slovenia said, we need intellectual honesty, realism, and imagination to address these paradoxes. And in concluding, I'd like to emphasize what I think is a key point. And this key point is that most water problems that remain unsolved do not remain unsolved because we lack technical solutions, but rather because of social, economic, institutional deadlocks and bottlenecks that prevent them from being solved. Of course, science and technology is essential. I'm an engineer myself, so it's a little bit strange that I make this statement. But my experience of life shows me that most problems remain unsolved, not because we lack solutions, technical solutions, but because of governance problems. This leads to the problem of governance that is absolutely essential. How are water policies formulated? Who are the actors? How do they interact? How do they act and react? It is very important to understand this to formulate an appropriate water policy at a country level and at the international level. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco Nunes Correa. Like a good professor, you've triggered a number of questions in me, starting with your water paradoxes. And I'm asking myself, what does this mean now for the conduct of the discourse, the public discourse and the policy debates we need to have? And how do we, dealing with this complexity, dealing with those paradoxes, dealing with the terminology challenges that those present, how do we then cope and formulate a water policy discourse that is accessible to people who do not spend their time all the time thinking about water, but may have other concerns on their minds and need a simplification of the discourse. Let's go on to the next panelist, Luška Kajfeš-Bogataj from Slovenia. She's a professor at the biotechnical faculty of the University of Ljubljana. She's here as a climatologist, making the link between water management and the climate, was past vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And I think this fits in well with the general theme of understanding how the complexity of water in a changing environment with the climate change upon us impacts our human societies and aggravates vulnerabilities that we have and forces us to adapt and help those who cannot adapt themselves to adapt to the new circumstances. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have this dilemma now because when you talk about climate change, it's hard to be optimistic, and the second is to be honest. Sometimes these two doesn't go together, so I'll try to be honest. Well, I will not spend too much time on climate change, but I would like to convey a message of climate change in a nutshell, because we can talk about climate change in various ways. And climate change consequences in a nutshell means that the countries which are already dry will get drier. The countries who have already problems with too much water will have even wetter climate. So, the problems that already exist will just get worse. But one of my nightmares is that climate change becomes a scapegoat for everything that's wrong with water. And in my view, the man remains the water first enemy. I'm talking about overexploitation and bad management of water. So it is thin line between climate change consequence and bad management. And water scarcity is something that I think will be more problematic than too much water because of distribution of the population over the globe. And when we talk about water scarcity, nobody mentioned today, everybody was mentioning more or less physical scarcity of water. Of course, water is physically scarce where the demand is higher than, for instance, amount of precipitation. But on this world also exists economic water scarcity. There are many people living in the countries with abundant amount of water, but they simply do not have the money to buy the water. I mean, this is something where international diplomacy, water diplomacy, for instance, has a lot to do in the future. So if I go on for the future forecasts, I'm sometimes amazed how developed and how well done are these prognoses. So every policy maker already has the problem at hand, and not in 10 years' time like this forum is about, but in 20 years, it is very clearly calculated that demand for water will be 40% higher than is today. And in most developing countries, it will be 50% higher. And all the diagrams clearly show which countries will be those with the problems. So from Bangladesh, South Africa, Indonesia, China, Russia, Mexico, Pakistan, even Brazil, and not to mention India, will be the future countries with big problems with water. So I sometimes just wonder how much politicians seem detached from these prognoses, which are very, very detailed, actually, and scientifically made. Another point, not very often tackled, is so-called virtual water. Because when we think about management of water inside the borders of one country, we must admit that actually water through the globalization is transported around the world in many, many products, or should I say in every product. 1 cup of coffee we all drank this morning, it took 140 liters water to prepare that. Not to mention that when we buy a car, we actually buy about 500,000 liters of water, and car was not usually produced in Europe. So we can talk about wet and dry nations. And the problem in this world is that we wet nations, for instance, Slovenia could be regarded as a wet nation because we have a lot of water, but we import food from the dry nations. So actually, and we take it for granted. But with the problems of water, all this trading with water might become a problem. And nobody actually is prepared for that. Countries that could grow their own food because they have the land, they have the means, they of course import it because it's easier and more convenient. But this time may end in the next 10 years. And this is something that we should really be aware of. Just another number, I like numbers. Every euro you spend buying whatever, from shoes to your car, for every euro spent, that is behind that about 80 liters of water. So now you calculate for yourself. Water and energy. This is something, we have 2 panels today. One is for energy, one is for water. This is a bit of a nonsense because energy and water go together. Water needs energy. We were talking about desalination. You know, for every cubic meter of desalinated water, you need about 10 kilowatt hours. But for one bottled water, I hate bottled water, to be honest, you need actually about thousands of kilowatts hours. So, I mean, you cannot have water without energy. But when we go to mitigate climate change, we all want to use renewable energies and things like that, but even that demand a lot of water. And my second problem is, one is bottled water and the second is biofuels. Because if we want to grow biofuels in non-sustainable way, we need for that 100 times more water than in case of using classical, for instance, fossil fuels. So biofuels and water go together, and we have to be very careful when we plan that. And now some solutions, to end with some solutions. Well, one of solution, in my view, water is, because I'm a meteorologist, of course, myself, is connected with meteorology. So we have to strengthen meteorological services. We have to have something, international organization that could actually predict floods and drought. We have such a center for drought management for Southeastern Europe in Ljubljana. It's a very good example of good practice. Research and education. This goes without saying because people still do not grasp some concept I was talking about. Of course, water use efficiency. I think that every country should have made the study on water ability cost curve, because there are a lot of measures that each country can provide with net financial savings, of course, in the lifetime of the measure. And they include so many things, from water reuse, building leakage minimization, new shower heads, irrigation scheduling, and things like that. So we have to know that the net saving solutions and then go for the very costly ones like desalinization or water transfer and things like that. And of course, a solution, in my view, has to be based about a vision, but a vision which is really fact-based, not just wish list visions. And I do believe in institutions. I wouldn't mind new ones, but they have to be effective, because without leadership in an institution, leadership is something that is also important within institution. Institution without leadership, it just takes money wastage. We need new laws, new regulatory schemes. We need new signals from the governments that water has a price, that water is a commodity. We need more involvement of private sector, because in many countries water is still regarded as a state-owned matter. And of course we need larger user efficiency. Efficiency, like with an energy, is a key tool. And of course technology wouldn't harm us. And I would like to end with, because this is organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that it is time for water diplomacy to take its part. It is time also maybe to educate special new diplomats on water. And as a professor in university, I think this is, it always stays with awareness and better education when you want to solve the problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Lučka Kajfež-Bogataj. I take from this the focus on the distribution and distributional effects of water, and the link that you made between the physical scarcity and the economic scarcity, coming back to that later on, and the link you made to virtual water, the water that is contained in the products that we trade internationally, the link you made not only to food security, but also to biofuels and therefore energy security, and the call to think about those three items in combination. Amongst the solutions you mentioned, there is water efficiency and the life cycle cost, considering the life cycle cost of investment in water-related activities, including small things like appliances. And the reminder that in addition to water diplomacy, we also should apply the principles of good housekeeping to water management. And good housekeeping is actually the root of the word economy. Think more and have good economics in water management. That brings us to the final panelist for today. John Matthews is the lead freshwater adaptation scientist in the World Wildlife Fund in the United States. I find it always amazing how the Americans invent titles. Listen, lead freshwater adaptation scientist. What tells you how many other lead scientists there can be in the organization? I think it is misleading to think of him as an American. Yes, he is. But currently he works in 20 different countries. So he has a truly global perspective on the water challenges. He's a lead author of the 2010 World Bank report on water infrastructure, climate change and biodiversity. So that wraps up the first round of the panel. John.
Thanks very much. I'd like to really begin by saying that in my experience, working both at local scales in particular places around the planet, and then scaling up to national levels, and then also engaging with global policy, that one of the important trends that I've noticed is that there's a very serious merger between the climate adaptation discussion that's happening globally and also the water community discussion, and that they're being viewed actually as a single conversation. And that's very important, it's very positive. I agree with many of the points that have been already made, and instead of trying to recapitulate them, what I'd like to do actually is provide a few kind of complex place examples, little stories about this interaction between climate and place and water around the planet. Perhaps the worst example is from my own country, from the US. In 1922, we developed a piece of policy called the Colorado River Compact. I think it was signed in or the early 1920s. And it was based on about 30 years of hydrological data that had been gathered from the Colorado River Basin. This spans about 6 states in the driest part of the US, the southwestern corner. Huge cities. It's sort of the China of the early 20th century, places like Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Arizona, many of the boom towns of Arizona, really fueled explosively by the availability of the water with the rapid development of the Colorado River Compact, managing water across all this basin. And it's also a transboundary river stretching down in northern Mexico. This 30 years worth of data turns out to have been, we know now, the wettest 30 years in the last 1,200 years. So this is a body of policy that has lasted over 80 years and has governed for many tens of millions of people, probably the most important economic growth region in all of North America, how water is allocated and distributed. Well, what's wrong with it? Well, if you look at probably the premier piece of water infrastructure in North America over the last century, it's the Hoover Dam. It's in the Colorado River. It's a massive dam. It was it was sort of the Three Gorges Dam of the U.S. for the 20th century. A lot of national prestige built up into the Hoover Dam. The water level is down about halfway. They can't fill it anymore, and that's because of this strong mismatch between infrastructure and climate that has developed in the Colorado River Basin. And this is a problem that is so intractable that we actually, when the Colorado River Compact came up for renewal, we renegotiated it around 2004. There was no agreement on how to include climate change into the process. So we have renewed it with absolutely no recognition for the shifted climate of this region. The second place I'm going to take you is to Nepal. I was in Nepal last March. Nepal is probably the 21st or 20th poorest country on the planet. It has very few resources. Most people are subsistence farmers. Its only major export, potentially, is hydropower, with its major audiences being the two tigers on either side of it, India and China. It has a lot of valleys. It has a lot of elevation. In engineering speak, it has a lot of head. So what are they doing? They're trying to rapidly develop their hydropower infrastructure. When I was visiting, I was really shocked in the Koshi Basin in eastern Nepal to see brand spanking new run-of-the-river hydropower dams that had become storage dams. Run-of-the-river dams have a reputation of being very environmentally friendly. They're good for ecosystems. They actually don't stop the water and store it like the Hoover Dam. They let the water keep moving. So they're supposed to be good for the environment, good for livelihoods. But there was so little water during the dry season that the water was just stuck behind these dams. These are brand new dams. This is not the Hoover Dam after 80 years standing. So there's actually a really serious problem in the way that we design dams. This is actually also not associated with the loss of glacial mass in the Himalayas. It's actually more related to the timing of the Indian monsoon and the increased variability. It used to be quite reliable, and now it's highly erratic. So it's not the sort of clean, easy Himalayan story that you expect from looking in the media. The last place I'd like to take you is just to the north. It's the Tibetan Plateau. It's a massive place. I was there just last month. It's 4 times the size of France. All western China, stretches up to Mongolia. This is an area where you see at roughly an average altitude of 4,000 meters, the start of many of the great rivers of Asia. The Amur in the north that is on the border between China and Russia. You see the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Suluin, the Ganges-Brahmaputra system. The Ganga-Brahmaputra system alone has more than 500 million people who live in that basin. The Yangtze has 350 million people who live in that basin. When I was there, I was shocked at actually the rate of change. That's the point that I want to be able to make with the Tibetan Plateau, is the speed at which the climate is altering water resources in this area. We drove maybe 2,000 kilometers over 2 weeks, and we interviewed many of the yak herders of this region. They've been in this livelihood of herding yaks, sheep, horses for at least 3,000 or 4,000 years. And they're rapidly losing their yak herds as the grasslands themselves literally melt away. And our team would interview some of the yak herders. We actually were camping out with many of these families. And we would talk to the oldest people in a family or in a community and say, when did you really notice this significant change that was occurring in the climate? And I really kept expecting that these individuals were going to say 1970 or 1980. They usually gave a date around 2003. So this is an area where the headwaters for most of the population centers of Asia that has an ancient livelihood that has been profoundly sustainable for millennia and is literally washing away downstream. This is a very serious problem. This is an institutional problem. It's a livelihoods problem. It's a sustainable development problem. And ultimately, I think it's a climate sustainable water management problem. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. I'm impressed by the way in which you introduced the concept of a river basin as a unit of management and counting the population. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know the resumes or CVs of people, where we are born, where we went to university. Out of fun, I once wrote one saying in which river basin I was born, in which river basin I lived, near which river I went to university. And it's quite strange how it conveys a completely different identity. And I wonder what would happen if all of us, including the panelists, always knew in which river basin we were born, we live, we went to university, and where our children, in which river basin they live, including sub-basin. And I'm also grateful that you said the rate of change is so fast we are running out of time, because that is the sense of urgency. And at the same time, we have to admit that in many areas of limited statehood with limited administrative capacities, do our government systems have the ability to steer the population through these periods of fast change, protecting their livelihoods, rearranging their livelihoods, adapting the agricultural patterns, the food production, the settlement patterns in such a way that the population survive? Or do we go through a series of crises, of catastrophes, of migration and of conflict resulting out of that? How do we cope with that? This is my view on the panel as a whole, and with that I would like to open it to all of you. If you want to ask a question, make a comment, give me a sign, and there's already one, and you can take the microphone to the gentleman. Do say who you are, where you come from. Do say to whom you address the question or the comment, and keep it short. I want to have as many people speaking here as possible. Go ahead, first one.
Thank you. Latvia, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, parliamentarian, professor of university. Comment. Obviously, people have been going in wars because of resources for thousands of years. So the only thing how we can answer the water challenge is probably to try really to stick together, because if we stick separately, it's like Franklin Roosevelt told, you know, we will hang also separately. So that's the only chance. Now, a question to our distinguished commissioner. We have been speaking here a lot about ecology from the perspective of scarcity of water, changing ecology. But another thing was a little bit less touched, which is the rising water levels and changing rivers. If I'm looking to the through the Baltic Sea strategy and our region, I would say that particularly eastern Baltic coast is not prepared well enough for instance, such a challenge as coastal erosion. We know examples in northern Germany, Frisian Islands, Holland, etc., where people have been for hundreds of years dealing with this. In our part, it is, let's say, not understood enough. And sometimes even we see from some ecologists telling, let it happen, this is how nature acts. So do you have in your plans anything to do with this? Because obviously no one separate country, either Latvia or Estonia, can do something separately here. Thanks, sorry for length.
Hans Friedrich, could you put up your hand so that the microphone finds you? If you permit, then collect a few questions and then we'll come back. Hans.
Thank you very much. Hans Friedrich from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. I'm very pleased to hear the comments of the panel. I mean, we very much see rivers as natural ecosystems and believe that the management has to be at that level. And I'm very pleased to hear particularly the Commissioner saying that this is what's happening. What concerns me a little bit, and I could feel that also coming through in Professor Bogotaj's comments, is a certain frustration that yesterday we didn't really talk about this. We talked about the future, we talked about the EU in a global position, we talked about defense, we talked about security, and water wasn't managed. Do we have the right tools in place? Do we have the right governance to convince our ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of finance, and the other key players?
Thank you. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go to the panel.
My name is Jordan Uzunov. I'm professor of Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, but I'm representing here the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, which member I am since 2004. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all the panelists about this very picturesque picture of the water situation and maybe for water supply situation in our continent or our regions, etc. But what about wastewater, and especially wastewater treatment? There are at least 7 R's, so-called 7 R's, for sustainability in water sector. Reuse, restore, remanufacture, etc., etc. What about reuse of water in our water policy? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Marta Sigeti-Bonifert. I'm the Executive Director of the Regional Environmental Center for Central and Eastern Europe. I would like to say that I was very impressed by the panelists. They all were stressing that sectorial integration is a must, good governance is a tool, and stakeholder involvement, without that, nothing will happen. But I don't see it happening. So what is really missing is that we are all standing on the track, the train track. We see the train coming, but so far nobody is taking the lead to actually take, us down from the wrong track and not to be hit by the train. So my question to the distinguished panelist is, to the EU, is the forthcoming strategies. We heard about the Baltic, the Danube is coming forth. What are the tools that can help us to take us forward? I'm asking also the other distinguished panelists, or if they have some thoughts about it, is how globally we could address this. What from common sense, we can actually cascade up to the panelists, instead of, not to the distinguished leaders of this world, that we will not end up in isolated silos and still do our own thing in our own way. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I started to work in water resources as an advisor also to the Ethiopian government on the creation of the National Water Resources Council, and as an advisor to the Senegal River Development Organization and several other. I am amazed that you have not really addressed the issue of interpatient transfers. And I wonder what happened with the American Water Alliance project of the Bechtel Corporation. The Amazon La Plata Basin project of Bechtel, the project of transferring water from the Amazon to the Senegal and Sahel zone, the Yenisei transfer project into Aral Sea. In fact, only one has somehow been started to be implemented. The Ganges down to in the direction of Tamil Nadu. And now the project of transferring Congo water into Lake Chad that is reduced now to a quantity of 3% of what the water was in the lake 26 years ago. Now, there's one dimension in water-related negotiations, that is the lack of reciprocity. A key dimension in international lawmaking is that you have a reciprocity among the partners defining norms. In water, you have upstream and downstream. And the question is, how do you create indirect reciprocity to enhance norms? There's only one river in the world, the Columbus River, inspired by Kennedy, that President Kennedy, where you have a compensation in money for upstream measures taken that benefit downstream hydroelectric energy production. Thank you.
You, sir, could you say who you are? I didn't get your
name.
My
name is Walter Lichem.
Thank you. And I think with those 5 questions, we have enough fodder for the panel. Don't feel that you have to answer to all of the 5, but you pick the ones that you feel most confident and competent about. Who would like to start? Carrie Ann.
Thank you. The 2 questions I wanted to respond to was one about sort of we're saying the right things, but do we really have this issue visible in foreign ministries? And we talk about integration and all of the things we need to do, but we're standing on the track and the train is coming right toward us. I think that from the perspective in the U.S. that we are seeing changes. And the fact that our Secretary of State has so visibly made this a foreign policy issue and so visibly pushed for integration across programs is a big step. And I say this because there are 2 major initiatives. There's the climate change programming initiative, there is the Feed the Future initiative, and there's a global health initiative. And significant funding is going into all of those. It has been pointed out that all of those need to consider water very seriously. And so I think from a political will perspective, we are taking that on. But the other part of your question, I think, is it working? And what I have to say is, having worked in international development and international policy on various sectors, there are cultural differences across the sectors. Forget about countries, which is just another level of challenge. But the health sector has been well organized, has a large global community, has numerous NGOs and PVOs. The agriculture community has very, deep roots. I mean, many of our nations, really, that was the first sector that we looked to for economic growth and development. And in international development, it has deep roots. My sense is that the water community is still a little bit of a junior cousin. And I think that is something that we all have to work on. We have to be very conscious of that. And so while we're having more meetings and talking about it, I think the visibility is there, but culturally across sectors, it really takes awareness and constantly bringing the issue back to the center.
Thanks. I wanted to respond to a couple of the questions. The lady from the Environmental Center and the gentleman from IUCN, in terms of what is it that we know that works, and where is it happening, and also what are some of the levels at which it may be occurring. I actually think that there are a lot of really positive stories. a lot of environmentalists get labeled as doomsayers. I like to think of myself as more of a change sayer. I think that's a much more positive spin, and there are a lot of really positive things that are happening right now. Actually, to use an IUCN example, IUCN has developed an excellent project in Tanzania in the Pangani River Basin with Mark Smith there. This is a giant e-flows project, basically, for an important river basin. And it combines climate adaptation into the system. It's a multi-stakeholder process. They're worried about hydropower, commercial farms, subsistence agriculture, pastoral nomads, city water supply and sanitation issues, and some industrial development. And they've developed what's really interesting about this process is they've actually pieced together a lot of different institutions that have agreed on a just form of allocation across the basin. And then they've added this climate change layer, which is that they look at the trends over the last few decades, and they see that precipitation patterns are generally declining, and it looks like that the models are projecting that they will continue to decline. So they're having a kind of stepped reduction in who gets how much water, and it's uneven across the allocation system. I think it's actually incredibly innovative and really, really positive. So that, at higher levels, I actually see a massive amount of interest in the development bank community. So the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and what is it that they're focused on? They actually are really interested in their investment portfolio. They go in, they fund projects like the Hoover Dam, except larger, and they're worried about a return on their investment. And so they're looking, you're talking about a piece of infrastructure that lasts 100, 200, maybe more years. Some of the oldest dams on the planet are actually in places like Yemen and Turkey that are 3,000 or 4,000 years old, and some of them still operating. So a piece of infrastructure is definitely spanning a climate-relevant timescale, and so you see these large institutions that are actually that they have tens of billions of dollars US it's going out the door, that they're trying to develop new approaches that are actually much more climate responsive and climate flexible, so that they don't repeat the same mistake that you see in the Hoover Dam or that you see in these small and micro hydro developments that I mentioned in Nepal as well. And I'd like to also just respond to the individual who was talking about the interbasin water transfers. This is a huge trend. I think some of the most aggressive and large-scale projects that have been proposed have been in India and in China. India is moving water on, is interested in moving water on a scale that would shame the Romans, and moving just vast sums. Quantities of water across the landscape, and they are starting to say, maybe that's actually a really terrible idea. That actually it makes a lot more sense to rethink what it is that we're doing in those places, that we actually think a lot more about the water use needs, and that we actually try to not keep encouraging essentially bad water use, bad water management in those places. China is if anything, is actually outdoing India in this thinking, and is pretty far along in the implementation process. It's called the South-North Water Reallocation process. And they're basically taking the north of China historically has a lot less water than the central parts of China in the south. And so they built in 3 vast pipeline networks a system to move water from the Yangtze, which is a massive river by global standards, far into the north. And this is actually, I think of it almost as a kind of imperial taking of water from the south for the north. And there's a lot of conflict in the Chinese government about if this is really a bad idea. to the point that they actually have canceled one of these reallocation pipelines, the westernmost one, because they felt like that the energy consumption, that is basically a conflict between climate mitigation and climate adaptation, is too much, it's too costly. Thanks.
Thank you. That was an exhaustive answer on several questions. Commissioner.
This might be even more exhaustive. I think it's fair to start with a statement which is pretty obvious. Policy making in water and in environment is extremely complex. So I think, I don't know if people are aware, but 80% of your legislation in your country is based on the legislation which was developed in European Union together. We are doing that via directives. What does that mean? That means that we believe that we should agree about the principles, about the goals together, but each country, each region should develop its own approach because the differences are huge. And we have today spoke about that enormously, how huge these differences are and how different approaches we actually need to use if we want to answer some of these questions. So I think it would be difficult to state that there is no lead, there is no vision, and so on. If I would simply explain where we are, what was actually already developed, and what we are implementing or not implementing too well, then we would find out that this area is covered pretty well. So we have now Water Framework Directive from the year 2000, which is introducing river basin approach. What are the supportive directives, which some of you might heard, but or are shaping our lives, but we don't really know that they are shaping our lives. One of the questions was the reuse of wastewater treatment. We have a urban wastewater treatment directive from 1991, which is functioning pretty well, but to be honest, implementation in some countries, it's pretty sluggish. So what we are doing, it's prosecuting or trying to fight against many of the governments, cities, that they would simply do what we have agreed upon. Then we have a Basin Water Directive, which made an enormous change. The waters in Europe, comparing to the quality of waters for bathing, has enormously increased in the last 10, 20 years. We have a Drinking Water Directive, Nitrate Directive, Floods Directive, Marine Strategy Framework Directive. This one is new from 2008, and of course it should still to be implemented. So we are far from starting from the scratch. And one of the problems which we are of course dealing is, which I mentioned already, implementation. Because many of these things which are connected with infrastructure, it's unfortunately costly. And differences between the south and north, between the dry regions, between the regions with a lot of rain, are huge and need different kind of approaches. That's about the substance itself. The second, the thing, if you are in the position as I am, of course, there are two vital questions which you have to deal with. One is governance, another is integration. So these two are, for me, name of the game. So if you talk about the governance, of course, it's important that we have global cooperation. Of course, it's important that we address it. But from the ancient times, the questions of water were dealt regionally. And this is needed. And we need this kind of cooperation between various levels, or we will fail, because simply we cannot look either to Brussels or either to UN or either to whom else to deliver us the answers. We have to do that, but the answers are normally bottom up, and it should be agreed, and also regional cooperation should be agreed, and we will always stimulate any kind of regional cooperation, believe me. Also in Baltic, in any area. But some of the answers should simply be found there with the people, the right people sitting together. Integration, probably if it's something really where I'm seeing the major problem of our policies is the integration. For example, we don't have the Water Framework Directive integrated in Common Agriculture Policy. We don't have it, and I'm currently in very serious discussions how to do it, where to go, how far to go. But this is basically the name of the game. Half of our land in Europe is managed by farmers. So if we want seriously to deal with the problems of drinking water, water as such, biodiversity, quality of soil, if we don't use the people who are today managing the land that they do it in a kind of public good philosophy, also the work for us, and we would partially repay their activity, then who will? Will we employ somebody from municipality to go on the farm and do the business? So I think it's extremely important that we don't do the environmental policies, including water, in a way that we do the damage, and then when the damage is done, then we see that we have to turn the time back, but that's the wrong approach. So either we integrate it in the policies immediately from the very scratch, or the game is lost. And from that point of view, and that's the last thing which I will mention, I agree with everybody that the real problem is it's time which is not on our side. And when we talk about climate change and when we talk about other things, time is not on our side. And the leadership, political leadership, it's crucially needed. It's crucially needed. And when when environmental ministers will start to seriously talk about the jobs, then, and when the economic ministers will start to seriously talk about the environment, about the opportunity which is offered by that, about the limits which are set by that, then we will be on the right way. Thank you.
In that context, Germany is on the wrong way. Lutz.
I must say that Commissioner Potočnik really said what I was wanting to say in more simple way, but still there is one thing left for me to say, and he said that there is no universal approach. Each country is different, but I think there is a common approach that could be used in many, many countries right now from this moment on, and this is proper spatial planning. Because a lot of problems with water, with climate change, with disasters have the common denominator. We just want to build something because this valley is nice, I like this river, but time is not our side. It is no longer possible. And it's same with the drought-prone areas. We would like to farm there, yes, but soil does not allow us. We would like to build a megacity on the spot where there's no water. But I think that the crucial moment is now really how to, because to avoid this train that's coming, this can be now better spatial planning, really taking water into account, taking into account too much and too little water. And I think that for the policy making, which is often done in the regional level, this is a good recipe. People do understand what that is. But there are too many pressures right now that people just forget the laws of nature. And water obviously obeys the law of nature, not the laws of that capital or whatever set to be valid.
Francisco, did you want to say something here? Yep.
Yes, I'd like to comment on two questions that were raised by the audience. The first one relates directly to what this lady has said on nothing is happening. We want sectorial integration, we want stakeholders' involvement, but nothing is happening. Well, I don't agree completely. Much more should be happening, but there's a lot of very interesting experiences going on in many places around the world. In Europe, France, for example, has some very interesting examples of involvement of local communities in water resources planning. A country like Netherlands has a very long and well-established tradition of sitting people around the table, discussing matters, building consensus and making decisions based on that. Those are just two examples in Europe. If you look at Brazil, they are doing wonderful exercise of involving communities in water decision-making, creating river basin commissions, discussing matters, having stakeholders participating. There's a whole system that was created by a law that now is maybe 15 years old and it's still being implemented. In Portugal, from 2005 until 2007, we made very, very important reforms in the water system with a new water law and subsequent legislation. We created river basin administrations and river basin councils with the participation of stakeholders. And it's a very active process, and they should discuss and approve the plans of activity of those river basin administrations and the budget. And a very interesting idea that finally came into practice in Portugal. That's the idea of users association, in which water users of a given river or aquifer come together to manage directly some of the problems that are involved in that water body. And some public powers are transferred to this users association. And we started collecting the water taxes, and part of those water taxes go to those users associations to fund their activities. So this is a direct involvement of stakeholders. So there are some interesting examples, and I'd like to underline that because we should learn and build on those examples. So this is first comment. Second comment, this gentleman mentioned the problem of interbasin transfers and the very critical problem of reciprocity. I fully agree with you, that's the very difficult question, especially when you have very typically upstream countries and downstream countries. You have a very good example in Europe, that's the Iberian rivers. Spain always upstream, Portugal always downstream. So they have the tap and they produce half of the water that flows into Portuguese rivers comes from Spain, and they have the tap. This is a security problem in itself. It's a very, very critical problem. Well, fortunately, we have overcome difficulties, but this reciprocity problem is a very critical one. And my experience is that you can only solve that problem if you, let's say, if you nest your negotiation in a broader negotiating context. And of course, those a little bit abstract values like bona fide, good faith, goodwill, play an important role. And we should take into account that this idea of providing water to someone is a very deeply rooted moral value. You should not deny water to someone. So this plays a role also at this level. Of course, this is very fragile as a negotiating principle, but it's present. It is on the table that you should not deny water because you're upstream. You cannot build a dam in the border and just don't let water goes down. This is a moral offense. Everybody recognizes that. So on the negotiating table, this is a value. Now, this value alone is not enough. You need to have a broader negotiating context. In the case of Portugal and Spain, we have a lot to gain in having a good relationship, and actually we have a very good relationship. There's a lot of matters being negotiated at European level. So water is one among many, and nobody admits that one is a nasty guy with respect to water. It would pay for it in other agreements. So this good environment for negotiation is the only solution for a very structural problem that is reciprocity. I agree with you. Just a very minor comment. I think it was John Matthew that referred with some surprise that climate change was not considered in negotiating transboundary agreements. I explain you why. It's very easy to understand. It's not that I subscribe that attitude, but I understand why. It's because uncertainty. When you negotiate these kind of agreements, uncertainty is a little bit scary for upstream and downstream. Upstream countries don't want to be confronted with more claims. And of course, climate change may lead to more claims. And downstream countries fear that considering climate change leads upstream countries to be more strict. So this instability, this uncertainty creates some sort of paralysis. Of course, this is not the right attitude. The right attitude was to have a good study, see the impacts, and make decisions. And it will come, but paralysis is explained by uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was, again, a very illuminating comment. We are on the final stretch, final statements from the panelists, and I would ask you to only say things that haven't been said before, but also to consider at least one idea that you want to give to the Slovenian government on potential Slovenian initiatives to improve our responses to water challenge that they can take in the international sphere. So don't think about water management just, but think about foreign policy, think about security implications, think about what the world can do and what Slovenia can do to make it happen. John.
So from my fairly biased climate-oriented view, what I would say is a very important issue that we need to consider in the next few years is to stop having the climate adaptation dialogue held hostage by the climate mitigation dialogue, which is we probably need to have some type of process that steps out of the UNFCCC that's very bold, some type of a partnership or a collaboration of many different types of governments and other institutions that can refocus in a very practical, operational perspective climate adaptation for all countries, not just the least developed or the most vulnerable, but for all countries. Thanks.
Well, what has not been said before. Okay, for instance, regarding Slovenia, I feel that abundance of water we have is our really a good chance in the future that maybe we should really see as one of economic alternative for Slovenia, not to sell water to other people, but to make use of this precious resource. We have touristic slogan, I feel Slovenia. I don't like it. We could say Slovenia, the land of water, the land of abundance of water. For instance, we should be proud of our water, but make all the necessary steps that it stays in that way. But another thing that is probably relevant and should be brought into international arena is water diplomacy education, and I think in some universities in Slovenia we could maybe also host such a postgraduate school or something. This is an initiative worth looking at.
Yes, well, water reflects society. And our societies became more and more interconnected, global, interdependent. And that's why an international framework for water management became important. And that's why water became a very important component of all diplomatic efforts. And it should be present. There's not only one problem of those considered major problems in our contemporary world that don't boil down to some extent to water problems. So it's better to take it explicitly and address it at the international arena as a component of our diplomatic activity. That's my recommendation, if I may say so.
Well, I think we said a lot of the key issues, but in regards to Slovenia, I think the fact that it is a water-rich country, I think that gives it a role to play in sort of being an ambassador as a country on this issue, because it's a neutral country. It's not being hurt right now, and it's not in a shortage or it's not in an overabundance. It seems to be just right, and that's a unique position to be in, to go into the international community and be able to talk among nations that are in different places in this question. And then the other point I would make is that I do think that yesterday's session on the big 10-year problems when water does not come up, I think that does really show us the visibility issue at the highest level sometimes is an ongoing challenge. And that's not a criticism, it's just a recognition. The agenda of complex issues is very crowded. And I think we have to recognize that, and we have to really bring the best imagination and creativity we can to sort of think about how to deal with this. Thank you.
Okay, for me, we have to, I can summarize in two questions to be addressed. I will say, how can the water challenge be addressed at different level, decision-making levels, is one question. Another one is, how can we combine water policy making at the global level with the regional, national, and local strategy? To me, is quite important. Another element that is new to the discussion to me is probably the change in human behavior. I think is a key element. Another one is we need to engage the business. It was talked about very quickly. But finally, for us, we need a strategy with urgencies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just one thing which I would like to say in the context of the climate change. the guidance document on adaptation on the climate change in water management, which I managed, that we had adopted last year, is including that the next generation of river basin management plans should be climate-proofed. So this is now finally strengthened. But now to Slovenia. I think that putting in this strategic forum water as a specific point on the agenda is something which should be truly recognized and praised. I hope that when the next time it will be on the agenda, it will not be parallelly with the Western Balkans, because of that visibility which you mentioned, but I think still it's, I think, an important step. Slovenia is truly a country with a good quality and also quantity of water. One of the issues which I would consider is that there would be a kind of stimulus to the political activities which would go in the direction like we have it for the Baltic Sea or for the Danube strategy where Slovenia is present, also probably south. So Adriatic Sea, Mediterranean, but Adriatic Sea specifically, because Adriatic Sea it's extremely fragile, especially the north part, and we see quite a lot of problems and discussions which could only be overcome if the countries who are dealing with Adriatic Sea should sit together and discuss the future of the Adriatic and us itself. Thank you.
Thank you. So this brings us to the end of this panel on the water challenge. And I think I conclude that it was a serious misnomer, because there is not just one water challenge, but as you heard, there are so many water challenges, so it should always be considered in the plural. We've seen the complexity of water management challenges in a changing world, and implicit in what was being said here on the panel, I think there is a call for adaptive management systems that are able to take into account new information, new stresses, new economic developments, new technological developments, and improve the management in their light. We need new approaches to governing water, including new forms of communication and of coordination within governments and between governments. And we heard some examples here. One question came to the rising sea level, and it wasn't really addressed by the panelists explicitly, even though many of the components would apply to that case as well. But the link was made between water management and spatial planning, to community involvement. As one of the heads of a French water agency once said, water is the blood of democracy. People talk about water, they have to do so in an inclusive way. And this is what is in essence what a society is about. It addresses its problems jointly. It negotiates agreements, behavior, norms, zoning in spatial planning or whatever it is that are acceptable to everybody, even though not everybody can be a winner in each decision. It is reciprocal. What we've tried to do, but I don't think we've been very good at this panel, is to find language that would make it possible to communicate the urgency of the water challenge and the importance of the water challenge to those people who are not at home in this very complex debate, but who have wider security policy concerns or concerns about how to manage international relations on their desk and on their minds. I think we need to think about more what we can do there. What does it mean for foreign affairs? The term hydrodiplomacy was mentioned. How can we build up the capacities everywhere in the world in order to address the water challenges successfully? Improve human security, water security, livelihood security, food security, all these points that were mentioned, whilst at the same time recognizing that security policy concerns are only a justification for improving capacity building in developing countries and changing the capacities in our governmental systems at home. That leaves me to thank not only the panelists, and you will do that hopefully